You know the M1 Abrams, the most powerful tank America has ever built. 60 tons of composite armor wrapped around a jet engine. The tank that for 30 years no enemy tank ever managed to destroy. It is fighting in Ukraine right now. So here's the thing that should bother you the moment you notice it. The Abrams rolling off the production line this year, and the very first Abrams from 1980 share the same name, the same blocky shape, and almost nothing else. America has quietly torn this tank apart and rebuilt it from the inside out over and over for 45 years. It is the oldest tank in the American Army and the newest one at the same time. And the machine America is building to replace it does something no Abrams has ever done. It goes backwards. Lighter, smaller crew, less of almost everything. After 45 years of making this tank heavier and deadlier, the future Abrams throws the entire formula in the bin. So how is a tank designed during the Cold War, before the internet, before the mobile phone, still the most powerful tank on the planet? How did it swell from 60 tons to more than 73 without anyone really noticing? Why, after 4 decades of making it bigger, is America suddenly desperate to make the next one smaller? And is the tank that was never beaten finally being beaten, not by a better tank, but by drones that cost a few $100s each? The answer runs through every single version, in order from the very first M1 to the AbramsX, that has not even entered service. And somewhere along the way, I'm going to show you the one night, in a sandstorm in the desert, when Abrams crews wiped out an entire enemy force in a matter of minutes and did not lose a single tank to enemy fire. Here's the secret hiding underneath the whole story. The Abrams stayed the most powerful tank in the world for 45 years for one reason. And it is not the armor, and it is not the gun. It is that this tank was never once afraid to throw away the thing that used to make it great. And the AbramsX is that idea taken further than anyone has ever dared. It begins not with a triumph, but with a humiliating billion-dollar failure. In the late 1960s, America and West Germany joined forces to build the tank of the future, a machine called the MBT-70. It was supposed to be everything at once. It had a suspension that could kneel down and rise back up, a crew of 3 crammed entirely inside the turret, including a driver who spun around with a gun and reportedly got motion sick doing his own job, and a main gun that could also fire guided missiles. It was a wish list with tracks, and it collapsed under its own ambition. The price per tank climbed so high, it became a national embarrassment. The two countries could not agree on basic decisions, and in 1971, the whole project was killed. America had spent a fortune and had nothing to show for it. But failure, it turns out, is an excellent teacher. The engineers took everything that had gone wrong, every overcomplicated idea, every gadget too clever to work, and they started again with one cold rule. Build a tank that actually works, and build it so it can be improved later. The program was called the XM1, and in 1976, a company called Chrysler won the contract to build it. But that contract came down to one of the strangest bets in the history of American armor. Two companies built prototypes for the Army to choose between Chrysler and General Motors. The two tanks were nearly identical in armor and firepower. The real difference was buried in the engine bay. General Motors offered a conventional diesel, proven fuel efficient, the safe and sensible choice. Chrysler offered the gas turbine, a screaming jet-style engine that almost nobody else on Earth had ever put into a production tank. On fuel economy, it was clearly the worse option, and everyone in the room knew it. But the turbine was lighter. It made enormous power. It started instantly even in brutal cold, and it ran quiet enough to earn that whispering nickname. The Army made the bold, thirsty choice and Chrysler won. It is a decision the Abrams would spend the next 45 years both blessing and cursing, the single most argued over feature of the entire tank. Bayfly 1980, the first ones rolled out of the factory, named after General Creighton Abrams, a hard-driving tank commander from the Second World War, who had gone on to lead the entire army, and the M1 Abrams made 3 bets that everyone else thought were strange. The first bet was the engine. Instead of a normal diesel, the Abrams used a gas turbine, the same kind of engine that spins a helicopter rotor or pushes a small jet. It gave the 60-ton tank the savage acceleration of a sports car, and a strange, soft, screaming whine that earned it a nickname, Whispering Death, because you often heard it long before you saw it. But the turbine had a dark side that would haunt the Abrams for its entire life. It drank fuel. It drank fuel sitting still, idling, doing nothing, because a turbine burns nearly as much at rest as it does at full speed. A single Abrams could empty its tanks in a day, which meant the fuel trucks rumbling along behind it, not the enemy in front, became the real leash on how far it could go. The second bet was the armor. The Abrams was built around a British invention called Chobham armor, a layered sandwich of steel and ceramic that shattered and swallowed an incoming jet of molten metal in a way solid steel never could. It looked like ordinary steel from the outside, and it was one of the most closely guarded secrets in the entire army. The third bet was the gun, and here the Abrams started out almost modest. The first M1 carried a 105mm rifled gun, a solid weapon, but not a giant leap over what came before. The Abrams did not arrive as a finished masterpiece. It arrived as a foundation, a tank deliberately built with room to grow. The first ones were rushed to West Germany to the units guarding the Fulda Gap, the stretch of rolling country where everyone assumed the Soviet tank armies would come pouring west if the Cold War ever turned hot. 4 men ran the tank, a commander, a gunner, a loader, and a driver, working as a single practiced machine, and their entire doctrine could be boiled down to 4 words. See first, kill first. The Abrams was built to spot the enemy through its thermal sights before it could be spotted, to fire on the move while older tanks still had to stop, and to land the first shot from farther away than the other tank could reach. It was never meant to trade blows. It was meant to win the fight before the enemy even knew a fight had started. And it grew almost immediately in 1985. Just 5 years in came the M1A1, and this is where the Abrams found the weapon it still carries today. Out went the 105mm gun, and in went a brutal 120mm smoothbore, a design licensed from Germany. The same gun family that armed the German Leopard. That choice was not an easy one to make. American pride wanted an American gun, and engineers had a homegrown design ready to go. But in test after test, the German 120mm simply shot straighter and hit harder, and the army swallowed its pride and licensed the foreign weapon rather than field a worse one out of patriotism. It was the same cold logic the whole tank was built on. Take the best answer no matter where it comes from, and never fall in love with your own ideas. All through the 1980s and the Great Reforger exercises, thousands of these new Abrams rehearsed for a war against the Soviet Union that everyone expected and nobody wanted. A war that thankfully never came. The American military had spent the whole Cold War terrified of Soviet armor, and now its main battle tank could finally punch through anything. The Soviet Union was likely to field from over a mile away. Then in 1988, the Abrams quietly got its meanest upgrade yet. Engineers wove a mesh of depleted uranium into the armor, one of the densest materials on Earth, so dense that it made the front of an Abrams very nearly impossible to penetrate. The same heavy metal went into its ammunition, in long dart-like rounds that hit enemy armor, with the energy of a freight train focused onto a single point. By the end of the 1980s, the Abrams had transformed from a cautious first attempt into a monster. Then it got the perfect war to prove it, in 1991. In the Gulf War, the American army rolled into the desert to drive the Iraqi army out of Kuwait. Had thousands of tanks, many of them Soviet-built T-72s, the same family of tanks the Abrams had been designed from birth to kill. And this is the moment I promised you at the very start. On the night of the 26th of February, 1991, at a featureless patch of desert known only by a map reference, 73 Easting, a small force of American armor ran straight into a dug-in brigade of Iraq's elite Republican Guard. A sandstorm was howling, thick enough to blind the naked eye. It did not matter. The Abrams crews were watching through thermal sights that turned the storm into daylight, seeing the heat of enemy engines while the Iraqis could see almost nothing at all. In 23 minutes, the lead American troop destroyed dozens of Iraqi tanks and vehicles without losing a single one of its own. The officer leading that charge was a young captain named McMaster, and his troop of 9 Abrams crested a low rise straight into the dug-in Iraqi armor and wiped out the entire defending force in front of them in those few astonishing minutes. The Iraqis were not amateurs. Many were Republican Guard, in Soviet T-72s dug into prepared positions and waiting. They fired back, crews in the Abrams reported the strange, almost unbelievable experience of feeling their tank rock from a direct hit, checking themselves for wounds and realizing the enemy round had simply failed to punch through. The next night brought the Battle of Norfolk, a confused, brutal, armored brawl fought in the dark, and the result was the same. By the time the 100-hour ground war was over, the American-led coalition had shattered one of the largest armies in the world. Estimates of Iraqi tanks destroyed run into the thousands. Abrams' losses to enemy fire were so low that for years afterward, people argued about whether the true number of crewmen killed by hostile tank rounds was 0 or merely close to it. The Abrams had not just won, it had rewritten what everyone thought a one-sided tank battle could even look like. Up and down the front, it was the same brutal story. The Abrams saw first, fired first, and hit first again and again from ranges where the enemy rounds that did come back simply bounced off the depleted uranium armor. Across the entire war, not one Abrams crewman was killed by enemy tank fire. The handful of Abrams that were knocked out were mostly hit by mines or painfully by other Americans in the chaos and the dust. The only thing that could reliably kill an Abrams in 1991 was another Abrams. It was the most lopsided armored victory in modern history, and it turned the M1 from an expensive gamble into the most respected tank on the planet overnight. But here is the trap that destroys most weapons. A machine wins one perfect war, everyone falls in love with it exactly as it is, and it stops changing. The Abrams refused. In 1992 came the M1A2. And the changes this time were not about armor or guns at all. They were about information. The M1A2 gave the commander his own independent thermal sight, so he could hunt for the next target while the gunner was still killing the last one. It began wiring the tank with digital systems, a computer backbone that let it share a battlefield picture with every other tank around it. The Abrams was quietly turning from a steel fist into a node in a network. Later versions added a system that painted the position of friendly and enemy forces onto a digital map inside the tank, a moving picture of the whole battle that no crew in history had ever been handed before. The tank that fought at 73 Easting had aimed through a thermal sight and a steady pair of hands. The tank that came after could share what it saw instantly with every other tank and every headquarters for miles around in a single decade. The Abrams had gone from the best gun on the battlefield to the best informed machine on it, and in modern war, seeing and knowing is very often the same thing as winning. And that turned out to matter. Because quick question before we go on. That thirsty jet engine gives the Abrams blistering speed and brutal acceleration, but it burns fuel so fast that keeping it running can be harder than fighting with it. If you were designing a tank, would you take the screaming gas turbine for the raw performance, or a slow, steady diesel you could actually keep fed at the end of a long supply line? Drop your answer below, because that exact argument is about to come roaring back. Through the 2000s, the upgrades kept coming, packaged into what the Army called System Enhancement Packages, the SEP versions, stacking on better displays, better electronics, better sights version after version. But then the Abrams ran into a war it was never designed for. After the invasion of Iraq in 2003, the fighting did not stay out in the open desert where the Abrams was king. It moved moved into the cramped hostile streets of cities like Baghdad and Fallujah. And in a city, a 60-ton tank built to dominate open ground suddenly had problems. Insurgents did not line up across a kilometer of sand to be picked off. They hid on rooftops and in alleys, and they fired rocket-propelled grenades into the thinner armor. On the sides, the rear, and the top, the places a tank designed for frontal duels was weakest. They buried enormous roadside bombs, some of them shaped charges powerful enough to burn straight through the belly of a tank from below. They got their hands on newer rockets, including a Russian-made one able to defeat armor that older grenades could never touch. For the first time since the Gulf, Abrams crews were being killed inside their tanks, and the loss of each one landed as a genuine shock, but the stories that came out of those streets also became legend. There are accounts of a single Abrams absorbing dozens of rocket hits and still carrying its crew home, of tanks that burned for hours being dragged back, rebuilt, and sent into the fight again. The Army studied every single loss and answered with armor for the belly, armor for the flanks, and a hard rule that a tank should almost never roll into a hostile city without infantry walking beside it to cover its blind spots. The Desert Champion was being painfully retrained for a kind of war it was never born to fight, so the Abrams adapted again. The Army bolted on a kit called the Tank Urban Survival Kit, slabs of reactive armor for the flanks, a shield to protect the commander when he was exposed in his hatch, and a remote machine gun he could fire from safely inside. The Open Desert Champion was learning the hard way, how to survive a knife fight in a hallway. This is the rhythm of the whole Abrams story. A new threat appears. The tank looks vulnerable for a moment, then it swallows the lesson and bolts on an answer. By the 2010s, that answer reached a new peak with the M1 A2 version 3. The modern Abrams, packed with digital armor, improved protection, and an auxiliary power unit so the crew could run all those electronics without burning the main engine, just to sit still. Some Abrams even gained an active protection system called Trophy, a set of small radars and launchers that physically detects an incoming missile and blasts it out of the air before it ever reaches the hull. A tank that shoots down the thing shot at it. The Abrams also went global. America sold it, in various forms, to allies all over the world, to Egypt, to Kuwait, to Saudi Arabia, to Australia, and more recently to Poland, to Romania, and to Taiwan, nations buying a piece of that fearsome reputation for themselves. And it was abroad, not at home, that the legend first cracked. When Saudi Arabia took its Abrams into the brutal war in Yemen, the world saw something it had almost never seen before. Saudi M1s ambushed by lightly armed fighters firing guided anti-tank missiles, knocked out and burning in grainy, video filmed from a distant hillside. The tanks the Saudis fielded did not carry the same secret depleted uranium armor. The American versions did, and they were often pushed forward without the screen of infantry that keeps a tank alive. But the message was loud, and it arrived years before Ukraine. The Abrams was extraordinary, but it was not, and it had never been invincible on paper. The modern Abrams is the most lethal and best protected version ever built, but all of that adapting, all of that bolting on came with a hidden bill that was quietly coming due. Every new piece of armor, every kit, every system added weight. The first M1 weighed around 60 tons. The modern SEP version 3 weighs more than 73. The Abrams had gained over a dozen tons across its life, and a heavier tank burns more of that precious fuel, strains its engine and transmission harder, and struggles to cross the lighter bridges and soft ground that a 60-ton tank handled fine. For 40 years, the formula had been simple, and it had always worked. New threat, add more armor, more electronics, more weight, more power. Then the formula hit a wall, and the wall was in Ukraine in late 2023. America sent 31 of its Abrams to Ukraine to fight the Russian army. These were among the most respected tanks on Earth, arriving on the largest tank battlefield since the Second World War. And the war they found there was unlike anything the Abrams was built for. The skies above the front were swarming with cheap drones, thousands of them, tiny machines carrying explosive charges, flown by an operator sitting safely miles away, hunting individual tanks, and aiming straight for the weak spots on the top and the rear. A drone that cost a few $100s could disable a tank that cost around $10 million. The tanks sent to Ukraine were an older export model, the M1 A1, stripped of the secret depleted uranium armor that America keeps for itself. They were handed mostly to a single brigade and thrown into some of the worst fighting in the East, and the crews learned a hard truth very quickly. In a war watched constantly from above by thousands of cameras with wings, a tank could barely move in daylight before a drone found it. The Russians would stop a tank first with a mine or a single drone, then send wave after wave of cheap drones to finish it off where it sat. It was a way of killing that no amount of thick frontal armor had ever been designed to stop. Within months, several of the Ukrainian Abrams had been damaged or destroyed, many of them by these drones and by mines, not by enemy tanks. The tank that went 30 years without losing a single crewman to enemy armor was being picked apart by machines a hobbyist could build in a garage. By the spring of 2024, there were reports that the Abrams were being pulled back from the most exposed parts of the front because rolling a 73-ton target into a sky full of drones was simply too costly. Now, the Abrams was not uniquely helpless. Every heavy tank on that battlefield, Russian and Western alike, was suffering the same nightmare. But for the American Army, it was a cold, clear warning. The 40-year formula of just adding more weight had finally run out of road. You cannot armor your way out of a problem when the threat costs a few $100s and attacks from a direction you can barely protect. And so in 2023, the American Army did something genuinely shocking. It canceled the next planned up-armored Abrams, the version that would have just stacked on even more weight, and announced it was starting over with a clean sheet. The future Abrams, it said, would not be heavier. For the first time in the tank's life, it would get lighter. And to see where that future is heading, you only have to look at the machine that gave it its name, the AbramsX in 2022. The company that builds the Abrams rolled out a technology demonstrator, a glimpse glimpse of the next generation, and almost everything about it is a reversal of the last 45 years. The AbramsX is built to weigh around 50 tons instead of over 70, shedding the weight that drones and bridges and fuel trucks had made into a liability. It uses a hybrid electric drive, an engine paired with batteries, that is designed to cut fuel use by up to half and let the tank creep silently on electric power alone, finally beginning to tame that 45-year fuel curse. It cuts the crew from 4 down to 3, using an automatic loader to do the job a human loader once did by hand, and it pulls those crewmen down into the safer hull, away from the vulnerable turret. It is wrapped in artificial intelligence and sensors, built from the ground up to spot and control drones rather than be killed by them. It carries a new, lighter 120mm gun, fed by that automatic loader in a slimmed-down turret that gives a drone far less to aim at. It is designed to launch and command its own small drones, turning the tank from a target sitting in the open into a hunter with eyes of its own in the sky. It is wired so that a crew of 3 can do the work 4 once did, with computers quietly handling the tasks that used to need another pair of human hands. America is not making this turn alone, or in a vacuum. Russia has spent years promising a radical new tank of its own, the T-14 Armata, with an unmanned turret and the crew tucked into an armored capsule, though so far it has appeared far more often in parades than in battle. Germany has shown off a next-generation tank bristling with a bigger gun and drones of its own. The whole world of armor is staring at the same drone-haunted battlefield and arriving at the same uneasy conclusion. The age of simply bolting on more steel is over, and the tank has to become something cleverer, or it will not survive at all. It is, in almost every way, the opposite of the tank it replaces: lighter instead of heavier, fewer crew instead of more, sipping fuel instead of guzzling it. And here's the second question worth sitting with. For 45 years, the Abrams kept its crews alive by being one of the heaviest, most thickly armored tanks on the planet. Now America is betting the future on a lighter tank that trades some of that armor for speed, electronics, and the ability to fight drones. Is going lighter the brave and correct answer to a new kind of war? Or is it quietly giving up the brute protection that made the Abrams legendary in the first place? Tell me below, and tell me why, because the Army has not actually committed to the AbramsX exactly as shown. What it has committed to is the idea behind it. The official future of the tank is a program called the M1 E3. The Abrams the Army wants in service in the early 2030s, and it is being built around those same hard lessons. Lighter where it can be smarter everywhere. Designed from the first day to survive a sky full of cheap machines that did not even exist when the first Abrams rolled out in 1980. So step back and look at the whole 45 years at once. The Abrams began as a careful answer to a billion-dollar failure. A tank deliberately built with room to grow. It started with a modest gun and grew the deadliest one in the West. It bolted on depleted uranium when it needed to be harder, digital brains when it needed to think, urban armor when the war moved into the cities, and missile-killing raiders when the threats started flying. It got heavier and more powerful until the very weight that protected it became the thing holding it back. Then, instead of clinging to the formula that had won it every war it ever fought, the Abrams did the one thing it has always done better than any tank in history. It threw the old answer away and started again. That is the real secret of America's most powerful tank. It was never the armor, and it was never the gun, because the armor and the gun have been replaced over and over. The Abrams stayed on top because it was never too proud and never too afraid to become something new. Its old Cold War rivals are mostly gone now, frozen in the shape they were born in, sitting silent in museums and scrapyards. The Abrams is still here, still arguing with itself about what a tank should be, still rolling into the newest war on Earth, about to transform one more time into a machine its first designers in 1980 would barely recognize. The name has not changed in 45 years. Almost everything underneath it has. That willingness to change more than any single gun or any slab of armor is the real reason it is still the most powerful tank in the world. And if you want the whole road that America walked to even arrive at that first Abrams, the entire bloodline of American armor, from the M4 Sherman that won the Second World War by sheer numbers all the way up to the M1. We broke down every single one of those tanks in its own video, and you can find it on screen right now. Like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.